For months, ever since the Mercedes talks ground to a halt, we've been talking about a Renault deal at McLaren. We speculated on our YouTube channel about a potential Honda Toro Rosso alliance, and now, according to Autosport, the deal has been done. McLaren are switching from Honda to Renault for 2018 and beyond, a move that brings with it a £100 million price tag, if you take into account the loss of free engines from Honda, plus their additional sponsorship. How are McLaren proposing to convert those red figures into black in 2018? Well, McLaren reckon they can recoup at least £80 million through improved results and thus more prize money. And on the back of those results, they hope, will come more corporate sponsorship. It's a gamble, no doubt about that, because Renault are not even Ferrari, let alone Mercedes. Still, McLaren have two excellent drivers, great facilities, and lots of hunger. Zak Brown, in his new role, had to do something, and this is it. I asked Craig Scarborough about the engineering implications of the Renault-Honda moves. Well, Craig, what are the repercussions from an engine point of view for McLaren making a switch at this stage of the season for 2018, and indeed, of course, for Toro Rosso and for Honda?
Well, for McLaren, obviously, they've known for quite some time that they may be changing power unit. I know we talked about the Mercedes was potentially going there. They probably spoke to Ferrari. They knew they may stay with Honda. So they've probably planned this around their production schedule. So they've kept the back of the chassis and areas around the side pods quite free so they can be flexible. But the sort of jobs they've got to do are quite complex and quite detailed. The basic simple thing is that the FIA set the bolt patterns for the engine and the gearbox, so that's straightforward, but everything else will be completely different. So the layout of the power unit is different with the turbo. The Renault is at the back of the engine. We know that Honda have their split engine, so there's a lot of volume at the front of the engine which won't be needed because everything's hanging out the back, which obviously then has repercussions on the top bodywork shape. You've then got, obviously, the gearbox then needs to be modified because it needs to cope for a big turbo being sat, whereas with the Honda it wasn't there. Honda and the Renault are very different on cooling, really, really different. Wow. You could, from my observations, I would say that the Renault engine needs lots more turbo intercooling. And if you see the Toro Rosso and the Renault factory car and the Red Bull, they've got two very large intercoolers at the back of the car. Now, McLaren with Honda have had a single, quite large intercooler, but I would say on volume terms they're quite different. So McLaren are really going to have to completely reapportion the shape and the size of the side pods to account for this. On top of that, we already know they're having to accommodate the halo. Obviously, that was confirmed quite late. Some of the specifications were quite late, so they've had to be quite flexible in that area. And also, we know that the halo affects the airflow into the roll hoop above the driver's head, and McLaren have used that quite heavily for cooling energy recovery systems at the back of the car, as well as feeding the engine airbox. Right. So they've got a big aero and a big mechanical change to set up, then like all of the software. And then they've obviously got to get this relationship going with Renault. And we have to remember, obviously, that they are the third major team to use Renault. So who is the factory team? Who gets the upgrades first? Who gets their attention first? So there's a big change going on there. So for McLaren, they've got a really huge job over the winter to be ready for those first tests.
It'll be really interesting one-on-one to see how the Red Bull now with Renault form compares with the McLaren.
Well, this is it. McLaren have said all through these past few years that their chassis is really good now, and if they had a better engine, then they would be winning races, gaining podiums. Now there's, they have to prove that, and they'll have both the Red Bull team, which is the barometer of a good chassis in Formula One for many years, and the Renault team, which are also really sort of catching up now through the season. I think next year could be a very strong year for them as well. So chassis is going to be really tricky. Obviously, they're a little bit on the back foot compared with those other teams because they've got all of this rework to do over the winter. So we'll see.
But who's got the harder job? The boys at Toro Rosso adapting to Honda, or McLaren adapting to Renault?
That's an interesting question. I would say, McLaren have got huge resources. We know they're a fantastic engineering operation. So you would have to look at Toro Rosso, a smallish team, quite late being given a big engine change. They've got the halo to cope with. They don't have the level of resources, even with Red Bull Technologies, the kind of the overriding engineering resource which sits over both the Red Bull racing.
What I was getting at, though, is in terms of the packaging job, assuming they had similar resources, what is easier, adapting a Honda to a Toro Rosso or vice versa?
In some respects, I think it could be easier, apart from the resources required, for Toro Rosso going to the Honda engine. Again, talking about this cooling package, talking about the turbo layout, and we know that Toro Rosso are quite good at packaging these things. Suddenly, with smaller coolers and without the need to put so much airflow through the roll hoop, Toro Rosso could come up with something very neat, very tidy next year. But, you know, that's the upfront design thing. Operating and running that power unit through next year could be a really tricky task for Toro Rosso.
And where do you see the factory Renault team fitting in with all of this? Will they try to do something different from the customer teams in terms of some of the layout of some of the, to make it unique for them, do you think? Or do you think they're going to simplify it as much as possible?
Well, the Renault team have always, and Lotus Sport, have always run a very different installation of the engine. And that's both in terms of the cooling and in particular where you put the electronics. There's some rule changes over the winter that means all the ERS electronics have to go under the fuel tank with the battery now. So that will be fairly similar. But yeah, I think again we will see the Renault factory team, as it were, actually changing the intercooler layout to suit the way they like to set the car up. But that's very much as they are this year. I don't see any greater differentiation between the teams next year.
The other thing to consider, of course, is the Red Bull-Renault relationship. Now, we glibly talk about it as if it's an ongoing thing, but it's pretty likely that Renault will withdraw their supply to Red Bull at the end of 2018, which puts Red Bull in an interesting situation, having had a year with Honda through the Toro Rosso B team, if you like. Then Red Bull could take over a major role with Honda. They've got the Milton Keynes Honda plant. They've got an association already with Honda in MotoGP.
Yeah, Honda, Red Bull, MotoGP is already a partnership. As you say, you've got the geography of Milton Keynes where Honda have got their UK engine base, or they don't do any of the manufacturing. It's just a logistics base. But it's always been one of those things that's been suggested to be expanded. And obviously Red Bull just up the road in Milton Keynes as well. So it's quite interesting. And I think that potentially the way Red Bull will run this relationship is much more important than how the engine currently is. Now, we've spoken lots and lots about how McLaren and Honda have worked as partners and felt that there's...
Or not worked as partners.
Or not worked as well as perhaps could be expected. But if Red Bull approaches the way that they've approached Renault over the previous years, where Renault provide all of the new parts and then Red Bull in this secretive building with the AVL virtual test track rig, which is a kind of a dyno and a 7-poster rig all built into one, and prove all of the parts before they hit the racetrack. If Red Bull can apply that rigor to the Honda relationship, which hasn't happened to date with McLaren and Honda, they could actually get a lot more out of Honda, and Honda could really start to sort of motor, to use a pun, in getting their program to where it really should be. Because none of us have any real doubts that Honda could produce a real top-end Formula One engine, but something always just sort of seems to make them stumble along the way. Whereas Renault perhaps have never had that sort of last mile of commitment to really bring their engine right up to the standard. So it could be potentially a really good step for Red Bull.
It raises the question of which is more brave, McLaren going to Renault or Red Bull going to Honda. We'll see in 2019. And actually beyond that non-laughing matter, the new engine regulations, you're pretty confident that Honda, come what may, will probably build a very good engine for those.
Yeah, 2021 regulations still sort of in debate, but they will be slightly simpler engines, twin turbos, going back to things that Honda know about, taking away some of the complexity like the MGU-H, which has been the sort of bugbear of lots of the manufacturers in the current formula. So, yeah, we would expect Honda to stay, and that would then generate a long-term relationship between Red Bull and Honda. Of course, we know lots of rumours about Red Bull talking to people like Audi, to Porsche, lots of buyout rumours, does Matsushita want to sort of exit the sport? Does someone want to come in and buy it? This puts a slightly different reflection on that. It would be unusual for Red Bull just to pick Honda for a 2-year relationship. They must be looking longer term at this to be their kind of preferred factory team and move forwards.